Right, we'll move to Abbie. One second. Abbie Vickress is going to be our next speaker. Abbie is an AHRC-funded PhD candidate at UAL, researching pluralist communication design practices and how knowledge is designed, framed, and circulated in cultural spaces. She's the British School at Athens Artist Researcher in Residence 2026 and co-founder of Imperfect Index, a series interrogating modernization and alternative practices in graphic design history. Her talk is titled Designing for Absence, Exhibition Graphics and the Ephemeral Object. Abbie, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Coming through headphones. Right. Let me just share my screen. That all good? Wonderful. Okay, so hi everyone. I am currently researching the design of ethnographic museum exhibitions, so mainly through exhibition graphics, but also exhibition design and curatorial strategies. So in this context, exhibition graphics are commonly understood as aesthetic and communicative tools, yet they also shape museum interpretation. So framing what knowledge is deemed significant and what a visitor is invited to think and feel about an object on display. My position is that these are not only design decisions, but knowledge shaping instruments. And designing for absence is a small strand of my PhD that investigates these ideas in practice, because I believe when no object is present, graphics can carry the full weight of knowledge making. And it is in these moments that the subconscious epistemological influence of exhibition graphics becomes impossible to ignore. So museums are not designed for ephemerality. They are designed actually against it. So the whole system, the vitrine, the label, the caption, the graphic scheme, everything is designed to fix objects in space, to stabilize them and to frame them with some kind of institutional voice. But ethnographic objects are not fixed. They are loaned, they are removed for research or conservation, they're taken off display for ethical reasons, and increasingly permanently returned to source communities. And when that happens, my observation is that the exhibition design tends to do one of two things. It either ignores the absence entirely, so a blank wall, an empty vitrine, a small printed, this object is temporary unavailable caption, or it treats absence as a problem to be hidden from view as quickly as possible to disguise it. So what I am proposing through this research is that absence is not a problem, it's actually a site of possibility, and that exhibition design has something really valuable to bring to that possibility. So to make this argument, I first distinguished between three kinds of absence in museum exhibitions. The first is what I would call mundane absence. So this is an object removed for conservation, a work out on loan to another institution. Maybe it's a piece in storage that rotates in and out of display. And these absences are temporary, they're relatively uncontroversial and almost entirely undesigned. They happen quite frequently, and museums largely treat them as administrative inconveniences rather than communicative opportunities. The second is transitional absence. So this is where long-term loans, permanent loans, and repatriation sit. So an object has been or is in the process of being returned. Maybe the object is still physically present, but its status has shifted through ownership claims or negotiation. And through the gaze of the institution, it's no longer simply a collection item, it's now an object in motion, so it has a contested history or a new future. Transitional absence also includes the spaces created in source community museums for the arrival or the receiving of repatriated objects. And then the third is ethical absence. So these are objects removed because displaying them is no longer considered acceptable. So this could be objects that perpetuate harmful messages or stereotypes, or objects whose display is now governed by new legal frameworks, such as the Human Tissue Act, which changed how UK museums could hold and display human remains. So transitional absences quite often fall into this category too, but ethical absences are the most politically charged, and the absence that design, in my opinion, most consistently fails to engage with appropriately. What all three absences have in common is that the gap left behind is treated as deficit, as something to be avoided or minimised. For example, in 2010, former UK Prime Minister David Cameron famously said that if we began returning objects to their countries of origin, the British Museum would be empty. This suggests that the perceived value of the museum exhibition is entirely hinged on the object, not the interpretation that frames it. But this research argues for the opposite, that these gaps are in fact desirable opportunities to do something more interesting, more honest, and more generous than an empty plinth, and sometimes even more than the original object could. And in the process, I hope some of these ideas could encourage more museums to engage with repatriation in ways that are both ethical and accountable. So I began by creating a framework to analyse existing design responses to absence and to inform the development of new ones. And this is what I'm going to talk about today. So it's this very ugly mapping tool that makes legible both what a museum chooses to show about an object absence through combined design and interpretation practices and what those choices reveal about the institution. It's not a classification system and it does not prescribe design solutions. It's more of a critical orientation device for practitioners and researchers to analyse existing design responses to absence and to ask questions about the redesign or the development of new displays. So on the x-axis, I ask, is the absence visible? What kind of knowledge does the exhibition design produce? And what does the design claim to know about the absent object? And then on the y-axis, I consider the institutional position, asking what do the design choices reveal about the museum's relationship with accountability or its evasion of it. So there are a lot of quite straightforward case studies where museums use labels or just leave gaps. But today, because of time, I'm going to concentrate on a few case studies that do something a bit more complex. So starting with mundane absences. Rather than removing Rembrandt's Night Watch during restoration, the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam built an enclosure around it, making the process the designed encounter itself. Visitors watched conservation happen in real time. This is a designed response to a mundane absence. Instead of taking the object away, the conservation comes to the object on display. Exhibition process becomes both the display and the display object, and strategically positions the institution as a caregiver rather than a collector or a keeper. This also manifests as a printed graphic, which is applied to other paintings in the collection, and this functions as a post-conservation reference, backdating that caregiver persona to before it became a display tactic. On a much larger scale, when the Boijmans Museum in Rotterdam closed for a 10-year renovation, it created a particular design problem. How do you maintain a relationship with a collection and a public when the museum itself is temporarily absent? The depot was their answer. As the world's first publicly accessible art storage facility, it makes the infrastructure of collection management and the experience itself. So visitors move through climate-controlled vaults, past works in storage, through systems that normally remain entirely invisible to the public. And I believe it largely inspired the new V&A storehouse in London, actually. This is a mundane absence at an institutional scale, the absence of a museum replaced by an acting museum, its own storage facility. The vernacular of storage becomes the exhibition design strategy here, the museum process as display again. The conventional exhibition graphics are quite minimal, but both decisions, the space and the lack of graphics, work to suspend the museum's authoritative voice, suggesting a neutral holding space during its absence. Moving on to traditional absences. The Africa Hub Gallery at Manchester Museum deals with transparency in a slightly different way by showcasing thousands of African artefacts, many with uncertain origins, in a deliberate attempt to ignite discussion around colonial era looting and restitution. The transitional absence here is twofold: absence of knowledge and the possibility of repatriation, which would create an absence. Design is used to frame where an object's interpretation is uncertain and as a platform to debate if the museum should keep it and if not, where it should go. What I find quite striking is while most of the museum's galleries reflect years of research, this display intentionally exposes absences in knowledge. The museum openly acknowledges that records rarely tell us who made these objects, when or what they were called, nor who owned them, how they were used or why they mattered, let alone how they were acquired. And that's quite an unusual thing for an institution to admit. and it is a design decision to display uncertainty rather than authority, to make the absence part of the exhibition rather than something to be resolved before it opens. Unlike the Manchester Museum, the Acropolis Museum in Athens was custom built. It has a purpose-designed gallery inside a purpose-designed museum to house a very particular set of objects, the Parthenon marbles, and also to make the case for the return of those taken by Lord Elgin and sold to the British Museum in the early 1800s. This is transitional absence by design. The display holds three things together. Keep here. Holds three things together. The marbles that stayed in Athens or were already repatriated by other countries, gaps for the unknown and unaccounted pieces, and plaster casts marking the gaps where the known pieces are still absent. And those casts are labelled with the names of the institutions not currently engaging with the returns. I personally love that level of passive aggression because labelling is a significant design decision and it shifts the implication outwards towards the British Museum and other museums. And it makes absence not something to be managed or hidden, but a purposeful, visible part of the display strategy, object story, and museum politics. Digital Benin does something similar. It's a digital catalogue mapping the location of Benin bronzes across museum collections worldwide. It is in effect a museum exhibition graphic, it's just not inside a museum. And this is transitional absence operating from an outsider perspective. Rather than designing within an institution, it uses design to make presence elsewhere visible, and in doing so makes absence in Benin legible. The navigation is built entirely around dispersal. Object by object, you can see when and where things were taken, what has been returned and what has not. Crucially, this is not an institutional project, it is an external intervention, one that implicates the institutions listed but not on their own terms, which raises an interesting adjacent question to my research. What does it mean for an absence that is politically and geographically legible but institutionally avoided? And finally, on ethical absences. So continuing with the theme of avoidance, the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford removed a collection of shrunken heads called zatars from display following a change in UK law, as opposed to an independent institutional decision they made on their own because they had been major visitor attractions for decades. In their place, the museum installed text panels explaining the decision, the consultation process with source communities, and the ethical frameworks that shaped the removal. The text is doing some of the work the object's used to, but it adds another layer. It's not replacing the encounter, it's documenting the process of removal. This is ethical absence, but what the exhibition graphics communicate is the process, not why the heads remained on display for as long as they did, or why calls to remove or return them prior to the law weren't taken seriously. Also, the contemporary graphic language, bright, flat, legible, sits in deliberate contrast with the Victorian curiosity cabinet display surrounding it. And I believe that clash is itself a distancing strategy, one I have often observed in museums with violent colonial origins. And yet, despite this, the rest of the late 1800s museum mostly remains intact. Repatriation does happen here, but the overall effect is a museum of colonialism more than a museum of ethnographic material culture. And then my last example. Similarly, the Wellcome Collection in London holds a vast collection of ethnographic objects. After numerous attempts to decolonise the Medicine Man Gallery, the institution changed tack entirely and closed it permanently, acknowledging that the display had been perpetuating medical history built on racist, sexist, and ableist frameworks and could not actually be decolonised. In its place, they commissioned a temporary exhibit, the Healing Pavilion, which repurposed the exhibition furniture into a sanctuary of sorts. This is ethical absence, but the response is not text, not reproduction, not explanation. It is sound, ritual, and collective experience. Visitors were invited into a durational meditation that acknowledged the violence of the collection's history through a practice of care without attempting to explain it away. And what makes this significant is the institutional admission behind it. Wellcome didn't attempt another round of reframing. It acknowledged that this space could not be decolonised and that the most ethical decision was to shut it down and create spaces for conversation about it instead. So the proposed framework aims to build gradually, starting with the smaller, less politically charged moments where design can begin to experiment with ephemerality without the full weight of repatriation politics bearing down on it. And it builds towards the more contested territory, arguing that what we learn in those smaller moments could give us some tools for the bigger ones. In my practice-based PhD, I'm collecting case studies and exploring several design strategies to enact this, including material reproductions and substitutions, such as casts, embossing, molds, visual overprinting, annotations, visible traces, durational and time-based formats, so anything with a sequential change, alternative navigation of the gaps, of the absences, through maps, routes, and guides, and digital or sonic mediation through sensory interactives. And through these practices, I am hoping to take ephemerality seriously as a design material. So not something to be overcome or to be minimized, but something to be worked with. So that could look like storage made visible, databases built around dispersal, casts that refuse to pass as originals, or where text where objects once were, or soundscapes where explanation falls short. And I don't think these are failures of museum practices. They are attempts to design ephemeral encounters that communicating something left behind, a trace, a question, a prompt for further thinking, to shape absence as something intellectually alive rather than a lack of object or a lack of knowledge. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. That was amazing. I have a lot of questions, but we'll get to it at the end. So our next paper is let's see, is presented by three speakers, Edward Nkata, Pampero Tembo, and Alexander Nyasulu. So I'll be sharing my screen with a recording of their presentations, and then they'll be around to take any questions at the end. Edward Nakata and Pampero Tembo and Alexander Nyasulu at Malawi University of Science and Technology are co-founders of the Vimbusa Healing Dance Project in Hewi, Rumfree District, Northern Malawi. Their work integrates documentary film, architecture design, and digital archiving to safeguard Tumbuka intangible cultural heritage. Right.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today at the DHS Student Conference. My name is Edward Nkata and I'm presenting together with my colleagues Pempelo Tembo and Alexander Hidden from Malawi University of Science and Technology. We are truly honored to be here and share our project titled From Fleeting Trance to Lasting Archive, Designing Preservation for the Ephemeral Encounters of Vimbusa Healing Dance in Northern Malawi. This project is very close to our hearts as a student from Malawi. We have witnessed firsthand how rich cultural traditions like Vimbusa are under threat, yet also powerful design can be when used thoughtfully to protect them. Over the next 15 minutes, we will take you on a journey from understanding the ephemeral nature of Vimbusa healing rituals through the historical and geographical realities in our communities to the concrete design objects we created as a response. We will show you how history guides our design process and how these interventions are helping to build a sustainable future for this living heritage. We hope this presentation not only shares our work but also sparks the conversation about the law of design, history in safeguarding intangible cultural heritage, especially from the global South perspective. So let's begin with the basics. What exactly is Vimbusa? Vimbusa is a traditional Tumbuka spirit possession healing dance that has been practiced in northern Malawi for generations. At its heart is a powerful combination of drumming, singing, dancing, and trance states. During a typical healing ceremony, a person who is unwell is brought to the gathering. The drum starts, the song lies, and the dancer enters a trance where spirits are believed to come through them. These spirits help diagnose the illness, whether physical, spiritual, or social, and guide the healing process. The whole community participates, singing, response, clapping, and supporting the dancer. These moments are incredibly intense, emotional, and deeply collective. You can feel the energy in the air, the vibration of the big drums in your chest, the call and response singing, the movement of the dancer. Yet, here is the key point for our presentation. The core experience is profoundly ephemeral. The dancer, the trance, the healing encounter, the specific power of that night, it exists only for those few hours and then dissolves once the ceremony ends. The knowledge, songs, and technique lives on primarily through the oral tradition and the memory. The ephemerality is that what makes Vimbuza both beauty and vulnerable. So, historical and geographical context. We're looking at Vimbuza, which has been practiced in northern Malawi since at least the late of 19th century. Our work is focused on Hewe village, Lumpi district, a rural community where Tumbuka culture is still very much alive. Historically, Vimbuza has played a central role in community health and well-being. It is not just a performance, it is a complete healing system that addresses both the body and the spirit. However, today, this transition forces multiple threats. Modernization and urban influence are pulling young people away. New religious movements often discourage traditional practices. Youth out migration to cities for jobs means fewer young people are learning the drums and songs. On top of that, climate change is affecting the rural life. Changing weather patterns disrupt agriculture cycles and make it harder to hold larger gatherings. If this pressure continues without action, we risk the gradual loss of many unique healing songs, drum rhythms, and ritual knowledge that has been carefully passed down through generations. So, this is the urgent context in which our project was born. So after our first hand visiting the northern part of Malawi with Tumbuka people in Hewe village, the first thing that we first in hand was the creating the digital archive after seeing the songs and the dances plus everything that was there. So while the documentary film captures the emotional and sensory power of Vimbuza and the performance spaces support the physical practice on the ground, the digital archive is what ensures the details knowledge survives for many generations to come. So after filming dozens of ceremonies, we ended up with 100 hours of raw recordings. The real work then began. So we also transcribed many of the healing songs. Many of these songs had never been written down before. They exist only the oral form. Writing them down and linking them to the recording was a big responsibility that we had. Um, in the end, this digital archive is not only cold storage for the past, it is a living tool. We hope it will continue to grow as more ceremonies are recorded and will serve as a bridge between the older generation's knowledge and the younger generation's future. This is how design can turn something fleeting into something permanent while still honoring its original spirit.
My name is Patrick Tembo from Malawi University of Science and Technology, and I'll take you through the remaining designed objects. So the second designed object is the community performance spaces we built in Hewe village. This was probably the most physical demanding part of the project. We didn't want to build just any hall, we wanted structures that would actively support and protect Vimbuza practice for many years to come. The design process started with listening. We had meetings with traditional healers, drummers, dancers, and elders. They told us what they needed. Space where the sound of the big drums could resonate properly without being muffled. Enough room for dancers to move freely during trance. Good visibility and seating for the audience and family members, and protection from the rain and strong winds that are common in Lumpi. We incorporated traditional knowledge into modern architecture. For example, we used locally available materials combined with better roofing and ventilation. The layout follows the secular gathering style common in Tumbuka culture, rather than a rectangular classroom shape. We also added small symbolic details, patterns, and proportions that reference traditional Vimbuza shrines. Construction itself was a community effort. In fact, students, elders, and villagers all worked together. There were challenges. Heavy rains delayed us. Materials were sometimes hard to transport on poor roads, but these difficulties taught us a lot about context-sensitive design. Today, these performance spaces are already being used. Ceremonies can now happen even during the rain season, and the improved acoustic have made the drumming and singing even more powerful. The building itself has become part of the cultural landscape. It honors the past while saving the present. This is designed as infrastructure for cultural continuity. The last designed object we created is our documentary film. This was not just about pointing a camera and recording whatever happened. From the very beginning, we approached the film as a carefully crafted, designed object with a clear purpose: to capture and preserve the ephemeral essence of Vimbuza that normally disappears the moment the ceremony ends. We spent weeks planning. We had to build trust with the community in Hewe village because these healing ceremonies are sacred and sensitive. People don't just allow filming. We had to explain why this was important for future generations. Once we had permission, we filmed multiple full ceremonies, often late into night. What we were trying to capture was not only the visual performance, but the full sense of the emotional experience. The deep vibration of the drum in your chest, the call and response singing, the intensity of the trance stays, the atmosphere in the room, and the collective energy of everyone present. These elements are almost impossible to describe in words alone. So, in the editing phase, we made many deliberate design decisions. We structured the narrative to move between close-up shows of the dancers in trance, wider shows showing community participation, and the interviews with elders explaining the meaning behind certain songs. We paid special attention to pacing, letting some moments breathe so the audience could feel the power while keeping the overall film accessible. We also thought about audience, that is both local Tumbuka people and international viewers. That meant adding subtitles and context without disrupting the flow. This film is not raw documentation. It is a designed casual object meant to carry the spirit of Vimbuza forward. Let me play a short excerpt for you now, so you can experience something close to the real encounter.
Hello everyone, my name is Alexander Inherden, a fourth year student at Malawi University of Science and Technology. In this final section, I will briefly discuss how history guided our design process, the benefits of our approach, and how design can make or help preserve and strengthen culture heritage for future generations. So let us begin with our design process, history as foundation. So a very important point, and one we're especially proud of, is that we did not design in a vacuum. Everything we created was deeply rooted in the living history and knowledge of the Tumbuka people. So from the beginning, we followed a clear, respectful process, which was to listen, to learn, reflect, design, and finally validate. This wasn't just a nice diagram, as you can see. It became our daily practice. We spent many weeks and months sitting with elders, traditional healers, drummers, and dancers in her village. Some conversations happened under the trees in the afternoon, others around the fire at night. We listened to the stories about how Vimbuza has been practiced since the late 19th century, how certain songs are used for specific illnesses, and how the spirits are believed to work through the dances. We didn't rush in with our own ideas. We asked questions like, what makes a good performance space? Which moments in the ceremony are most important to capture on the film? How do we organize the recording so that we remain useful and respectful? So only after deep reasoning and reflection, we did move into the design phase. Every major decision, the layout of the performance space, the structure of the documentary, and the metadata system in the archive was checked and validated with the community. As one respected elder named Chivundula Gondwe beautifully explained, machilisiko kakushitika na muntu yumozapera yayi wakuimba ngoma, wakuimba sumu kweniso wose au wakusazgana pamoza wakuchita nchito ikuluchomene, which translates to this work is not done by one person alone. The drummers, the singers, and everyone who gathers together, they all do a very big job. This code became our guiding principle. The project succeeded because it was collective. History wasn't just the background research, but it was the foundation that shaped every design choice we made. Let's jump into the benefit of design. So this brings us to what we see as a real benefit of design. For us, design is not about creating something new and freshy that has no connection to the past. Instead, design became a powerful safeguarding strategy. That's a way to protect and strengthen a living tradition that was at risk of fading away. We were very careful to create hybrid approaches that blend traditional Tumbuka knowledge with contemporary tools. We didn't invent new dances or change the rituals. We designed the objects that support what already exists. Look at how the three design objects work together as a complete system. The documentary film makes Vimbuza visible to the world. People in Malawi and far beyond can now experience something closer to the real encounter. The community performance spaces supports daily practice on the ground. Ceremonies can now happen comfortably even during the rainy season. The digital archive preserves the detailed knowledge, the songs, the techniques, the stories, so it doesn't disappear with the passing of the elders. Together, these three objects, which you see here, create something much stronger than any of them could alone. This is the true power of design when it is done with respect and humility. It doesn't replace culture, but rather it helps culture revive and survive in the changing world. Now let's jump to the from ephemeral encounters to sustainable futures. So through this work, those beautiful but fleeting trance encounters are slowly being transformed into sustainable culture features. Think about it. A powerful trance movement that once existed for only a few minutes during one night can now live on through the film. Young people who move to the city can still learn the songs from the digital archive, and when they return home, they can have proper spaces where they can continue the practice. These designed objects will now actively shape the future history of Mbuza. New generations in Hill Village will now be able to learn the tradition properly. practice it confidently, and even evolve it while staying firmly rooted in its origins. We believe this student-led project from the Global South offers a hopeful and practical model. Many communities around the world are facing similar challenges with the intangible cultural heritage. From our experience, it shows that when young people combine deep respect for history with thoughtful design, it is possible to turn the threat of loss into an opportunity for continuity. So to conclude, design history can and should move beyond simple preservation of objects in museums. When we root our work deeply in local knowledge and work closely with the communities who own the heritage, design has the real power to transform impermanence into continuity. This is exactly what we have tried to achieve with the Vimbuza Healing Project, turning fleeting trance encounters into lasting archive and a living future. Thank you so much for your kind attention. We really appreciate you taking time to listen to our story, and we would be very happy to take your questions, whether about the design process which you just did, the challenges of working in rural Malawian setting, the documentary film, the buildings, and how this approach might apply to other intangible cultural heritages.
Thank you everyone for joining us for panel 4, Recovering Histories. In this session, the panel explores the recovery of ephemeral histories around design objects. Although the objects themselves may remain around us, the encounters, contexts, and meanings attached to them are often fragile, partial, or difficult to reconstruct. I've seen amazing archival photos from presenter slides, so I'm very excited for this panel. First paper is Recovering Ephemeral Experience from the Orphic Gold Tablets by Maria Marsh. Maria is a final year undergraduate studying classics at King's College London. Her dissertation examines the agents attached to the Orphic Gold Tablets within Dionysiac mystery initiation. Her research interests focus on subjective experience and lived religion in the ancient world. Maria, whenever you're ready, you can share the screen and take over.
Hello, everyone. Okay. Is my screen sharing fine?
Yes.
Okay. So my presentation is titled Recovering Ephemeral Experience from the Orphic Gold Tablets. My research question was, how did mystery initiates interpret and experience the powerful but fleeting ritual that the gold tablets poetry immortalizes? There's a couple preliminaries that we have to get through fast because this is quite a convoluted topic and I imagine new to most of you. So the typical fate of the dead in the ancient Greek imagination was that in the underworld, the soul was restless, was not conscious, and had no memories. So you can imagine this is something that people would not look forward to. So mystery cults were secret rituals requiring formal initiation, through which sacred knowledge was revealed. And we actually only have very few clues. We have no idea what happened because no one actually disclosed the ritual, but we have people reflecting on their experience. And initiation essentially promised a privileged afterlife through meeting the gods through the ritual, which forged a special bond with them that allowed for them to be favorably looked upon in this life and the next. This is a very important quote that I think sums everything that we know about mystery cults up really well. So, initiation, according to Plutarch, is that the soul at the point of death has an experience like that of men who are undergoing initiation into the great mysteries,
And so the verbs to die and to be initiated and the actions that they denote have a similarity. In the beginning, there is consummation of every possible terror, shivering and trembling and sweating and amazement. But after this, a marvelous light meets the wanderer, and sacred music and holy visions. So, what scholars have gathered from this is that initiation was a form of a symbolic rehearsal of death and rebirth, which allowed the initiate to conquer death when it actually came at the end of their life. Now, the god Dionysus is the god of wine, madness, which is referred to as mania in ancient Greek, and theater. And the mysteries of Dionysus are more obscure than the Eleusinian mysteries, which were institutionalized and happened at a specific temple in Athens. The mysteries of Dionysus did not have an official civic context, and we know very little about them. Now, Orphism is based on the mythical singer and poet Orpheus, who descended and returned from the underworld in a very famous myth. He has a very huge connection to Dionysus and mystery cults, and the gold leaf tablets reproduce Orphic myths and ideas. Onto the tablets themselves, they're also called gold leaves because of the thin gold foil material, and they're actually very small, about 5 centimeters by 5 centimeters. And they were found all over the Greek world in graves buried with individuals from the 4th centuries to the 2nd centuries BC. And they usually had eschatological texts to help the soul achieve a special status in the afterlife. So a lot of them actually helped the dead person navigate the topography of Hades, where to go, what to say to specific deities to be let in into the special status. And mystery initiation was a prerequisite for obtaining the tablets. Current scholarly approaches to the mysteries are mainly focused on the Eleusinian mysteries because we know a lot more about them. And there's a big emphasis on performance, subjective experience, and cognitive aspects that allowed for initiates to truly believe that they're seeing the gods in the flesh. My approach, because the tablets have rarely been analyzed to understand subjective initiate experience from them, I extended mystery cult approaches to be able to apply the same understanding of individuals to the gold tablets. And I followed McGlashan's application of predictive processing, which essentially denotes that the brain selects schema, packages of information based on past information and cultural knowledge to interpret new environmental cues. So these schemata are more heavily relied on in emotionally charged and unknown situations like mystery initiation. And beginning from the Palina tablet, which was my main case study, and its poetry was likely recited during initiation by a practitioner, I analyzed what caches of information, which were drawn from the wider Greek conception of Dionysus, would have been activated for the initiate when they were going through initiation. And that would have helped them rationalize that confusing experience. Now, the Palina leaf reads as, "Now you have died, and now you have come into being, O thrice happy one, on this same day." This line likely refers to initiation as a symbolic death and rebirth, which I've mentioned before. Tell Persephone that the Bacchic one himself has released you. The Bacchic one means Dionysus, and probably relates to the fact that through initiation, there was a special bond forged between Dionysus and the initiate. Bull, you rushed into milk. Quickly, you rushed into milk. Ram, you fell into milk. You have wine as your fortunate honor, and below the earth there are ready for you the same rights as for the other blessed ones. And my work mainly focuses on trying to explain these animal formulae, which are very enigmatic and no one really has an answer to what they could mean. I argued that animals represent both the initiate and Dionysus at once and represents a collapse of boundaries between these different identities during the climax of initiation. So the reason that Dionysus could be identified with the animal is pretty straightforward. The bull is his paradigmatic animal form. One of his names is actually the bull god, and he transforms into a bull in the play The Bacchae by Euripides. And he very often metamorphoses into multiple animal forms concurrently, which means that his incarnations can coexist simultaneously. So the other animals mentioned in the tablet could just as well refer to him in that same moment. Why could the initiate be identified with Dionysus? I argued that there are a lot of literary and artistic conventions that cognitively primed individuals to identify with Dionysus during initiation. Dionysus especially had a very human duality that allowed for his worshippers to identify with him. For example, in the Bacchae, he is called the man-turned god because he was born from a mortal woman. And the Thurii tablet, which has which is one of the gold tablets, calls the initiate a god instead of a mortal, which parallels that same fate of transitioning from a man to a god. And Dionysus is very often depicted as reclining on sofas on cups, which were used at symposia, which were drinking parties. And that is exactly what the people attending the drinking parties would have done, reclining on couches. So the users could see Dionysus as a reflection of themselves. And this, I think, is a really, really interesting example. So sympathetic eye cups have a mask of Dionysus in the middle and two eyes on the sides, and they are very strange to us, as you can see on the right. If you wanted to drink from them, you would have to bring the whole vessel up to your face, which means that the eyes, and especially the mask of Dionysus, would have been essentially worn by you because other people would kind of see Dionysus's face instead of yours. So it encourages the user to wear his identity as a mask. And this is also very important. Dionysus's mythical persecution paralleled the initiate's experience. So the Orphic myth of Dionysus Zagreus was not part of the conventional religion, but it's found from many disparate pieces of evidence in the ancient world. In it, he was ritually dismembered by the Titans, but he was reborn. And this acts as a model for how the initiate would expect their experience of initiation, which was already known to be symbolizing of a death and rebirth, but that would give them another reason to really experience him. And most importantly, mania, which is the state of Dionysiac madness, is experienced through enthusiasmos, which was a spiritual possession or a metaphysical union with Dionysus. It literally means en-goddened, to have God within you. Okay, so I have tried to reconstruct how the Pellina tablet might have been interpreted by initiates. But what about the actual experience and what actually happened during the ritual? There's a lot of possibilities. It's very likely that the poetry was recited by the practitioner, and perhaps with some sort of involvement from the initiate. And also, there are a lot of myths about Dionysus rushing into the sea, which is the same word used on the tablet of the animals rushing into milk. And Dionysus's followers are called rushers, Thyades. So Pharaoh has suggested that there was a mimetic reenactment of that rushing action during the ritual. But Jennings would have something to say to disrupt our straightforward understanding of this. So mythical narratives do not guide ritual action first and foremost, or the acquisition of ritual knowledge. The action of the ritual would be generated by the experiential understanding of having gone through the experience and actions themselves. And that would have been very personal, subjective, and unique for each individual. But the action of having performed the ritual retrospectively encouraged a rationalization of what those actions symbolized. And this is where the cultural schemata would have likely come in, not before the ritual or during it, but after, when trying to understand what has happened to you in that moment. So the difficulty in ephemerality. The initiate's construction of meaning did not begin from the myth, but from the action of the ritual, from the listening, reciting, and possible rushing motion. And the actions and the arising interpretations are lost to us. The conclusions from my work were that the Pellina tablet immortalizes an experience during which the initiate was spiritually reborn into a new status. and that new status would have been understood as acquired through the collapse of boundaries between an animal, the worshipper, and the god Dionysus. And the spiritual union with Dionysus would have been surely very poignant. But the actions of the ritual remain lost. So, how do we approach such enigmatic objects which immortalize only a myopic glimpse from the spectrum of experience that initiation encompassed? So, the predictive processing theory, I think, is very key to this because drawing on the relevant societal understanding and cultural associations of Dionysus and initiation, which are topics that we know much more about than actual Orphic ritual, it can aid us in reconstructing a culturally authentic way in which the tablet's words and by extension its ritual were understood by initiates. So what I think is that the difficulty in ephemerality can be supplemented by seeking the way in which the object, however novel or elusive it may be, is doubtlessly a product of its culture. And we can start from the breadth of societal information available to the user and us, the researcher, to replicate the potential process of interpretation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Maria. Next paper is Textile Impermanence in Design History, Unearthing the Weaving Workshop at Sex Pompeia at São Paulo, Brazil. The paper will be presented by João, if I'm pronouncing correctly.
It's João, but Victor is fine.
João Victor Britos. Santos Carvalho, sorry. João is a PhD candidate in the design program at the Faculty of Architecture, Urbanism and Design at the University of Sao Paulo with a master's degree in textile and fashion. His doctoral research is supported by the Sao Paulo State Research Foundation. Over to you.
I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, let me just open the chat. Okay. Can you see my screen? Can you hear me nicely? Okay.
Yes.
Hi everyone, I'm João Victor Brito, I'm 27. I wanted to thank the DHS team, Abbie, Aurora, Katie, and Alice for making the process so easy, so fun. So I'm going to be talking about textile impermanence in design history. And I usually preface my research by mentioning that I got in touch with my study object through my master's research, actually. For my master's dissertation, I researched the Latin American indigenous references in the work and trajectory of Annie Albert's famous Bauhaus alumni and modern textile design pioneer. During the research, I felt the need to comprehend her design process on a deeper level than theory allowed me to. So I ended up joining an introductory weaving class at this place called SESC Pompeia. Now, what is SESC in SESC Pompeia? SESC stands for Social Service of Commerce. In their own words, they're a private organization supported by entrepreneurs in businesses, tourism, and services. They aim to provide well-being and quality of life to professionals working in these industries and their family members. But their actual impact is directed towards workers in general and society at large. SESC was created in the 1940s, but has been reinforced or guaranteed by the Brazilian Constitution of 1988, along with 8 other similar organizations under the S system. And in the state of São Paulo alone, SESC has 43 locations or centers dedicated to culture, sports, health, food, and what my research touches upon, non-formal education. This is a pamphlet promoting the creativity workshop at SESC Pompeia in 2001. And SESC Pompeia is one of their facilities here in São Paulo. And it's not only its architectural project, but part of its cultural program was conceived by iconic architect Lina Bobardi. This is the SESC Pompeia building, and here's a picture of Lina inside the building. And she conceived this project between 1977 and 1986. By attending the weaving course at SET Pompeia in 2022, I started to organically engage with the history of the weaving workshop, which is a process I described with the concept of epistemological curiosity created by education scholar Paulo Freire. And what that is a spontaneous curiosity that becomes increasingly scientific through critical reflection. I realized that the workshop had a very rich history, and that led me to questioning why haven't the design history or the art history fields looked at that space as a possible study object yet? This gap especially contrasts with the broad literature surrounding the Bauhaus Weaving Workshop, for instance, or other textile efforts in key institutions in 20th century design education and design practice. I mentioned not only the Bauhaus, but the Soviet School of Art and Design, the Temas, also the Wiener Werkstatt and Deutsche Werkbund, also in Europe. So I started building my doctorate research project around this. And this is a picture of my rigid header loom in the introductory weaving class, and here's me weaving at the workshop. Some more pictures of what is developed at the workshops in introductory and advanced classes. And so fast forward to where I'm at right now in the research, my guiding question is, how do the relations between design, art, and craftsmanship emerge throughout the history of the weaving workshop at SES Pompeia between 1976 and 2026? I'm looking at how the workshop's history both articulates and creates tensions between the fields of art and design, but also craftsmanship practices, questioning the very separation between these three instances. In the first year, through oral history, we mapped out 30 trajectories of artists, designers, and craftspeople that have been involved with the workshop as teachers, students, curators, or coordinators from as early as 1976 through 2026. And right now, we're in the middle of interviewing most of them and locating documentation surrounding the ones that are no longer with us. Here are some of the names we mapped out, divided by categories. There are teachers, students, members of coordination, or curators of exhibitions. There's also a category with just one textile artist. He doesn't fit in the other categories, but he's still very relevant to the history. He worked alongside Lina Bobardi in conceiving the textile workshop. One of the things we touch upon in the research is the fact that even though SESC, the organization, insists that all the workshops they promote should be seen as non-formal education, the weaving workshop has successfully equipped its students to adopt the textile practice as a profession. It's interesting how some of the students became teachers in the workshop later on, or ended up creating their own ateliers, workshops, and they worked within the textile industry. They participated in exhibitions in museums and galleries. And this whole process led us to finding and drawing connections between the workshop's history and other important institutions in the city of São Paulo, understanding a network of relationships we're calling the São Paulo Textile Arts and Design Circuit. It includes the São Paulo Museum of Art, the São Paulo Museum of Modern Art, the São Paulo School of Arts and Crafts, the National Fair of the Textile Industry, the Brazilian House Museum, amongst many others. We also mapped out 29 exhibitions promoted either in SES Pompeia or in these other institutions, where textile artifacts played a protagonist role, and all of these exhibitions involve at least one of the agents we mentioned before, but most of the exhibitions involve several of them. We found severe gaps in the documentation surrounding the SES Pompeia weaving workshop. Very few documents related to it were located in the own institution's archive, which is called SET Memórias. However, the richness of the iconographic and documental service we conducted with the interviewed agents so far underlines how much of the workshop's history is left out of the institutional archive. Here are some of the images of the material. It's a very small portion of it. I'm going to get to the numbers later on. But we have pictures of the weaving classes in the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. We have pictures of textile artifacts, and we have ephemera, such as pamphlets and folders, catalogs. We have textile artifacts, physical and photographed. So the reflection surrounding this process can be synthesized through the expression textile impermanence. I describe textile impermanence as this confluence between physical and cultural dimensions of the challenges of preserving textiles and the stories surrounding the people and the spaces associated with their making. In regards to the physical dimension, when I was dealing with the literature surrounding indigenous or pre-Columbian textiles for my master's research, one aspect pointed out by authors in the archaeology field, and here I mentioned two books, one by Paul Hills, one by Marcia Arcudi, but both books have many authors within them. They all talk about the difficulties of physically preserving excavated textiles due to variables such as humidity, biological agents, friction, etc. And similarly, drawing a parallel, when archiving textiles, the conservation and maintenance processes can be quite challenging, even for relatively recent material. Regarding the cultural dimension, the gaps in design history and art history surrounding trajectories and spaces associated with the textile field, especially female trajectories, originate from a very asymmetric and hegemonic history that tends to be based on gender, race, class, etc. And here I draw on authors such as Griselda Pollock, Cheryl Buckley, and Ana Julia Melo Almeida. Cheryl Buckley specifically argues that a refusal to properly document and research the textile artifacts that are created in domestic or craft-forward spaces and contexts ends up directly excluding the works and trajectories of women, given that oftentimes up until the second half of the last century, these contexts were the only ones available to them. In Brazil, where higher design education was only implemented in the 1960s and higher fashion education only in the 1980s, this becomes even more apparent. The exchanges between designers, artists, and craftspeople are especially relevant to how the Brazilian design field was constituted. Authors like Lina Bobardi, Aloysio Magalhães, Dijon de Moraes, and Adélia Borges prolifically explored this notion. And the confluence between these two dimensions makes for a degree of impermanence. Textiles are easily historically erased and overlooked, especially within design history. And when they are unearthed, either literally or metaphorically speaking, it can be quite challenging to keep them present through conservation, archiving, documenting, and researching them. It's fundamental to understand, though, that we're not arguing that the cultural dimension of textile impermanence is necessarily caused by the difficulties in the physical preservation of textiles. We don't intend to justify one through the other. Instead, we argue that given these physical challenges, we should collectively be a lot more concerned with the cultural preservation of these artifacts, the trajectories and spaces. And this, of course, resonates with the theme of ephemerality explored in the conference. Now, how do we face these challenges? What do we do with this idea, the style impermanence? One of the strategies we are adopting in my research is to constitute an archival collection of the material we're gathering and eventually making it publicly available. In order to do so, I've digitized over 700 items from the private archives of 4 of the people I interviewed so far. However, creating an archival collection means bringing these separate private archives together. So we developed a cataloging system that helps to manage all of the items and are currently applying to a fragment of the base, the iconographic and documental database. We did like a test run in 42 of the items and are understanding how to move forward. We came up with 6 conceptual categories in the cataloging system: typology, date, associated agents, associated institution, and associated events, and provenance. The categories were created from initial assessments of the material, understanding what we needed to comprehend about them to fulfill the objectives of the project. And of course, this whole process brought a reflection on the archival practices we're engaging with Jacques Derrida and Rodney Carter's writings on archives. We're able to understand the relations of power and hierarchies implicit in the making of the archive. With every choice we make in the process, other aspects can potentially be neglected. And there's, of course, the danger of crystallizing textile practices that aren't aesthetic, especially when talking about craftsmanship. The notion of an active archive explored by Kathleen Russell seems to embody these concerns. So we're playing with this term a lot. And she talks about engaging with the contents of the archive, not only by feeding it data or expanding the cataloging process, but by expanding on the very premises that originated the archive to keep sort of revoking the archival practice. And in this sense, we intend to keep tensioning the separation between design, art, and craftsmanship, and exploring the gender dynamics present in the contents of the archive, while being very aware of its limitations, but also of its potential. And there's still a number of agents to interview and iconographic and documental surveys to be conducted in their private archives. We know there's a lot of material still, but we hope that these materials can integrate this archival collection that we're currently building. I'm still in the second year of the PhD, so there's still a lot of work to do, but that just makes me excited, really. And here are some of my references, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joao. Now we're moving on to our final paper, which is Housing a Home, Elsie de Wolf's Photo Albums of as Interiors. The paper will be presented by Sarah Shields-Rivard. Sarah is a PhD candidate in art history at Queen's University, Canada, whose doctoral research highlights women artists, designers, and feminist interventions in design history. Her dissertation revisits the gendered and racial implications of Elsie de Wolf's design work as seen in Dwelling at the Margins, Global Perspectives of Home. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much. Everyone can hear me okay? Yes? Okay, great. I will share my slides. Okay, let's see. Okay, let's try this again. Sorry. Yeah, okay, that should work. And perfect. How does that look? Good?
Great.
Thank you. All right. So thanks to the student ambassadors at the Design History Society for having me present an excerpt of my dissertation research. It was also recently turned into an article for the Interiors Journal, which is currently under review. So if you have any feedback, either during the Q&A or I'm going to leave my email at the end. I think it's also in the program. Feel free to do so. So let's set the scene. In the late 1930s, the American interior decorator Elsie de Wolf, later known as Lady Mendel, hosted regular Sunday luncheons at Villa Trianon, which was her estate near the Château de Versailles. It was held in the gardens, an outdoor pavilion. These gatherings brought together an international circle of royalty, artists, politicians, socialites. And during one such luncheon in the spring of 1938, the French photographer Roger Schall documented the event for Vogue. And among his unpublished photographs is this image here on the left of two women seated outdoors in the garden, absorbed in this large photo album as they turn its warped pages. And today, that photograph offers an entry point into a remarkable archival rediscovery, which is a group of Elsie de Wolf's personal photo albums that resurfaced at auction in 2024. In October 2024, Bonhams presented the collection of Leonard Stanley, which included what appeared to be the largest collection of Elsie de Wolf material ever to appear at auction. And among the furnishings, paintings, decorative art objects, there were dozens of personal albums and scrapbooks that were compiled by Elsie de Wolf. Their contents varied remarkably. So photographs of travels, parties, interiors, shoe collections, gardens, her dogs, friends, and much more. But together, they really revealed a side of Elsie de Wolfe that's often absent from the historical record. And these albums, they preserve not only the spaces she decorated, but also the objects she valued, the people she entertained, and this kind of social world that she cultivated. Several of the volumes were acquired by an American-Canadian interior designer and collector, meaning that an important portion of de Wolfe's surviving archive now resides in Los Angeles and Toronto, which is where I was able to consult them for my dissertation research. And this Canadian location creates this unexpected connection to de Wolfe herself. She's remembered primarily as an American interior decorator, who spent much of her life in France, but her father's family was originally from Nova Scotia in Canada, and a town named Wolfville, which her father's family literally gave their name to this town. Um, so she visited quite a bit as a young woman, and in her autobiography, she recalls it as a very formative experience. What makes these albums especially significant is that none of de Wolfe's original interiors survive intact today. So furniture, decorative art objects that she designed or collected or refurbished are really spread across private and public archives. Their provenance is not always very reliable. Same for her interiors. Some have been scattered, the objects themselves, or have been assembled, reassembled in the context of the Frick collection. So as a result, these albums and the photographs that they contain function not merely as records of lost spaces, but they function as these extensions of de Wolfe's decorative practice. They invite consideration as designed objects in themselves, as these carefully assembled artifacts that reveal how she organized, narrated, presented, and preserved her own decorative world. Many design spaces and objects survive in fixed temporal states through photography, which allows historians to access these otherwise ephemeral sites of study. But the materiality of those records is often left unconsidered, typically treated as documentation of these domestic spaces rather than objects of design in themselves. So this research considers the role of de Wolfe's personal photo albums, particularly those featuring her own interiors in quote unquote housing a home. So rather than studying such interiors solely through the images that record them, what might it mean to examine the photographs and the albums that contain them as interiors in their own right? In what ways do the contents of a photo album, through their sequencing, framing, material structure, come to resemble the logic of an interior? So organizing images and pages into rooms, narratives, spaces of inhabitation. In turn, how does the album itself function as a material container? So as architecture, as a home. For example, like a house, each album possesses an exterior and an interior. So its architecture, whether it be fabric or leather, floral or green, its title stamped in gold or penned in black ink, these would have been carefully selected to represent the contents within. In turn, its pages served as these kind of blank walls upon which de Wolfe could decorate, arrange, and display the items she collected and selected with her well-honed decorative eye. Images are captioned, in de Wolfe's swirling calligraphy. You can see it quite well in the green ink, is mostly what she uses throughout the 50 years worth of albums that she put together, as well as some kind of block lettering by her longtime assistant, Hilda West. And these captions kind of guide guests through the album as if like a host would, guide you through the rooms of a home, but also in some ways they kind of function as like didactics in a museum. There's that kind of curation that's happening as well. These albums, they would be shared with visitors as objects of admiration, like we saw in that first image. And they transform domestic photography into a performative act of self-fashioning, staging domesticity and femininity while blurring the line between private, archive, and public display. They functioned as these curated extensions of de Wolfe's domestic interiors, allowing visitors to inhabit the home through its bounded pages, even as they moved through the physical spaces of the home, whether they were in these very curated gardens or within the house itself. In her autobiography, de Wolf explained how her homes served as the most profound and consistent relationship throughout her long life. She said, and I quote, "When another woman would be dreaming of her love affairs, I dream of the delightful houses I have lived in." She wrote that each of her homes in New York, Versailles, and Paris marked distinct phases of her life, functioning as records of changes which took place in each decade by decade. In 1905, she and her long-term partner, Lady Elizabeth Marbury, acquired the historical French villa, Villa Trianon, near the entryway gardens of the Château de Versailles. And no house accompanied de Wolf through life changes more than this villa, which she lived in for nearly 50 years and remained intact as this kind of ode to her 30 years after she passed away. Although extensive records survive of Villa Trianon's architecture and grounds, little was known about the interiors prior to her arrival. So there was nothing to preserve or restore within, so she instead looked to the neighboring 18th century royal interiors for inspiration, which you can see here in the image on the right. There's a bust of Marie Antoinette. There's a mural by the fashion illustrator Etienne Drian of the stairs of Versailles. As well as these like amazing kind of like 18th century inspired stools that are then kind of made modern with the leopard print upholstery. The house appears both as a carefully documented interior, as well as a social stage for parties and luncheons. And one album, which is at the bottom here, Fancy Dress Balls, preserves photographs from the annual circus balls of 1938 and 1939 that she hosted at Villa Trianon, which were attended by the likes of Elsa Schiaparelli, Coco Chanel, the Duchess of Windsor. And Roger Schall once again documented these events, and through his photographs, which are then included in her albums, we see these decorated spaces, costumed guests, and carefully orchestrated performances of hospitality. And beneath one of the photographs, she is seated beside the dance floor, and she has handwritten a caption that says, "Do you think anyone will come?" And the question now reads with a degree of poignancy because the Circus Ball of 1939 was actually the last hurrah of the Paris Versailles social season. The world that was preserved in these albums on the verge of a dramatic change as war once again closes in on France. So when de Wolf fled France in 1940, several albums were left behind and were damaged by occupying German forces. One volume is marked with swastikas across its cover. Several photographs have been ripped out, leaving pages torn and empty. An explanatory note inserted in one album simply states, "Pages destroyed by Germans occupying Villa Trianon." De Wolf also followed wartime developments closely from abroad. She would collect these newspaper clippings and preserve them in her albums to document kind of her concern for the fate of her home and its contents. However, the home was remarkably in good condition when she returned, but this experience nonetheless increased her impulse to document and memorialize and preserve Villa Trianon. She soon commissioned the French photographer André Ostier to take room-by-room photographic records of the home, producing some of the most detailed visual records of the house to survive in these albums. They're black and white photographs. They capture the interiors, mostly inhabited, almost like these ghostly spaces. So no people ever appear in the frame, but de Wolf's presence is everywhere in the decorative elements that become synonymous with her style. So the green and white striped walls, checkerboard floors, mirrored rooms, chintz-covered furnishings, and touches of leopard print. Some photographs attempt to encompass entire rooms, while others linger over details that might otherwise go unnoticed. But together they really create this visual inventory of the house and its contents. A photograph of the boudoir, which is on the right here, captures a series of green silk cushions embroidered with white silk text. And on one of the pillows, the stitched letters read, "Can't take it with you. There are no pockets in a shroud." The phrase is kind of morbid, a bit playful, yet it takes on this added resonance when viewed alongside the albums themselves. This outlook perhaps contributed to her detailed records of the house and its interiors, transferring this materiality of its space into the bound pages of an album, not knowing what was to become of her estate beyond her lifetime. The albums then become a second home for Villa Trianon, one that outlasted the decorative world that they were intended to record. So, in conclusion, Villa Trianon faces redevelopment today. Its interiors are gutted, its gardens are overgrown. The house, as de Wolf envisioned it, now exists more fully in the bound albums she assembled rather than its centuries-old architectural frame. In these volumes, the photographs, annotations, pages, and covers do more than document and preserve its domestic spaces. They actively construct and house them. Their recent reemergence ensures that this remarkable archive remains available for future study and appreciation. And nearly 90 years after Roger Schall photographed those two women viewing the album in the garden of Villa Trianon, those same volumes allow us to visit the house once again, room by room and page by page. Thank you so much.
So I'll give a kind of very, very brief overview of our panel and our papers. And then what I'll do is I'll introduce the speakers one by one as we go round. As has been common over this conference, we'll then save questions for the Q&A section afterwards. So if you have a thought, a question, or a response, or anything that could be reasonably seen as one of those things, make a note of them, and we'll come back to you after our panelists have finished. So this is our final panel of the conference, and we have 3 papers which are going to be presented in the order that I'm going to introduce them now. So we'll have first Stereotypography, Can a Font Be Racist by Saki Mutsura. Then we'll have Printing for Change, the dissemination of queer communication and publications in the UK and US by Libby Brindle. And then finally, we'll have the Geography of Appetite, Menus and the Visual Performance of Imperial Reach by Maria Velasco Zambrana, who will finish. And these papers come under the kind of rubric or rhetoric of dissemination, right? So we're thinking about spreading, reaching, maneuvering through these 3 subjects. And we're going to begin with Saki Matsura. And Saki is a multidisciplinary graphic designer based in London and Tokyo. And they have a strong interest in the role of graphic design in visual storytelling. And Saki's practice focuses on graphic experimentation across typography, printmaking, and publication design. Growing up in Singapore and now studying in London, she developed a curiosity towards how Japanese culture is perceived in the world. And as I mentioned earlier, the title of this paper is Stereotypography, Can a Font Be Racist? So Saki, whenever you are ready, you can get us started.
Yeah, sorry, I had a slides prepared. Is it
Yeah, you should be able to share them.
Yeah.
Yeah. If not, I have them. So if you have difficulty, I should be able to share them also.
Okay. Could you see the slides?
Yep, I can see it. Looks great.
Okay, so I will get started. So my paper is called Stereotypography, Can a Font Be Racist? To briefly introduce myself, as I've been introduced, I'm Saki. I'm a graphic design student at UAL. I'm graduating next year. I was born in Tokyo, grew up in Singapore, now based in London. My work is mostly based on research-based, and I also like to be involved in using archives. And many of my work is inspired by my experience of living in multicultural cities and my culture. And something that motivates me to pursue graphic design is making cute things. So about my paper was submitted as a dissertation for my final year, and the main inquiry for this paper was how was typography used to establish stereotypical Japanese aesthetics. Yeah, so when you envision Japanese culture, you may think about cherry blossoms, kimono, geishas, or Mount Fuji. But I was interested in how these visual stereotypes formed and how typography played a role in that process of the building of the stereotypes. But what is stereotypography? So stereotypography or stereotypical typography mimicry is when fonts are used to represent a specific culture through incorporating or mimicking the unique characteristics of the authentic script to visually communicate the ethnicity of the subject. So as an example, I put a screenshot of a font database called the font. In their website, they have a section called Foreign Look, and under that, they have a category named Chinese and Japanese. Under that category, there are over 350 fonts that are inspired by Chinese and Japanese or Korean culture, and while other categories such as Arabic or Greek has around 100 fonts, which indicates the popularity of Chinese and Japanese and Korean-inspired fonts. And it shows that they are popular because they are probably very effective in communicating the culture through fonts. As Shaw, who is an American design historian, stated in his paper, stereotypes, though crude, serve a common purpose of shortcuts, visual mnemonic devices, which shows that these fonts are capable of showcasing that they're showcasing a specific culture just through the visuals and just through the characters. And I was interested in this topic because I encountered a stereotypography in real life in London when I was in first year. The example on the left is the logo I saw. Because I can read Japanese and I speak Japanese, when I saw this font, which incorporates Japanese characters with alphabets, I was really confused because my brain couldn't comprehend that it was actually alphabet and not Japanese. And I was very confused and kind of, in a way, offended. But then at that time, I thought I was just being sensitive, or I was just being, I was just being too sensitive over a mere font. But then I was thinking about this font for quite a long time. And through this opportunity, I decided to use this research as a process to understand why I felt offended by a font. The chop suey font or the wonton font is the most renowned Oriental font that is used globally since 1880s. Their presence has been widely accepted throughout the history, and it hasn't been criticized until very recently. They are assumed to be inspired by the Chinese calligraphy, the form of Chinese calligraphy, but through research and through careful observations of this character and how they are constructed, I realized that they kind of contradict the basic principle of Chinese calligraphy. So, for example, they only use a specific element of calligraphy, which is the ending stroke of each letters. And this specific stroke have rules. For example, they have to be facing the direction and angles. But So if you think about how they are contradicting the basic principle of the calligraphy, this font is just constructed of pointy triangular shapes forcibly morphed into alphabets, and they actually essentially doesn't have any relationship with the actual Chinese culture or the script, but then they are seen as Oriental. So why are they seen Oriental is because of a very important factor of stereotypical typography, which is the association. As illustrated in this diagram, when a font is associated with a certain culture, the public will recognize the association, which gets unconsciously ingrained in their brains and in their memories. And that font if it gets repeatedly used, the association with the culture and the font gets strengthened. And when the association is strengthened, the font is more effective in communicating a culture, and the cycle will keep on going because it's more effective, thus more popular. But it is important to acknowledge that not only the non-native speakers use these fonts, native speakers has been using these fonts throughout the history, especially the first generation immigrants, often for their business. As a minority in the West, to survive as a minority in the West, it can be perceived that the authenticity in representation was not a pressing concern compared to the growth of their business. And I couldn't go into this deeper, but stereotypical typography actually has a very rich visual history. And I believe, even though they are stereotyping and it should be avoided, the rich history that they have should not be disregarded. So bringing the focus back to Japan, stereotypical typography has been used in this ephemera called ranji, which is a tea label that was exclusively produced for export purposes. They travel around the world as a platform to internationally advertise a country in the late 19th century, after Japan has opened up its borders to the world. It was one of the earliest forms of Japanese modern graphic design. They integrate the Japanese traditional culture through the uses of motifs and patterns and Western graphic design, which is shown through the typography. Focusing on the typography found in ranji, you can observe that they use a very exaggerated ornamented fonts repeatedly, and we can see that they have a font that has a similar style to the wanton font. And the designer behind these tea labels were actually the ukiyo-e artists. So ukiyo-e is the Japanese woodblock prints that was very popular. But when their business was declining, the ukiyo-e artists started taking orders for the tea labels. So ukiyo-e artists had the knowledge of illustrating kimono patterns, and they knew the traditional motifs. So they used that knowledge to create this labels that was very high concentrated with Japanese graphics in a very small surface area. And because the export of the Japanese tea was very popular, the labels could have contributed to how Japan was perceived by the world, because that was the main export product of Japan. Bringing in more modern examples, these two logos are the logos for government-led tourism campaign. The left logo was used from 2003 to 2010, and the right logo was used from 2010 to present day. We can see that they had a drastic rebrand of their logos. And I was wondering why they would do such a drastic change. And something I realized is that the left logo, which uses a very thick calligraphy brushstrokes, actually reminded me of discount offers and sales and bargains, and actually like menus of izakaya. So izakaya is a Japanese cheap drinking houses, and in their menus they often use these calligraphy style fonts. So as a Japanese person, looking at this logo immediately reminded me of something that is cheap or discounted. But for someone who has never been to Japan or who has a very small knowledge of Japanese culture, they might view that the left logo is more authentic compared to the right. And this difference in the perception of authenticity is something I found very interesting, and I'll be touching that a bit later on. However, stereotypical typography is not a vital element of a design to transmit the culture, which is shown through this poster called Beautiful Japan. It was another tourism advertisement created in 1930. This poster even observed that they have cherry blossoms, Mount Fuji, the geisha, kimono, bamboos, the vertical writings. They have a lot of these Japanese stereotypical like imagery. And compared to the other examples, the type that is used in this poster is very minimal. So it creates a theory that the usage of stereotypical typography communicates the producer's lack of confidence on the subject. However, when a font is employed in a discriminatory setting, its association with racism will persist continuously, and it's that how they were used as a tool for hate speech is difficult to break out from. If you look at the examples, these are the anti-Japanese propaganda during the World War II. They used typography identical to the wanton style, and the right example actually mimics the way Japanese people or the non-English speakers speak in English. For Japanese person, I'm not sure about other languages, but for Japanese people, it's difficult for us to differentiate the pronunciation of R and the L. So when we say very, it might sound like we're saying belly, which is shown in this propaganda. And so whenever I spot a wanton font or a font that is similar to the wanton font in the public, it makes me immediately think that the designer may have not done enough research, or they are not aware of how this font was used in the past. And it makes me a bit disappointed, but at the same time, it makes me feel that it is our duty to raise the awareness and to let people know about the history behind fonts. Extending from stereotypical typography, through research, something that stood out to me is a question that stood out to me is why were Eastern nations so obligated to portray themselves as an exotic Orient? And I read Orientalism by Edward Said, and I found a very interesting extract that was talking about the power of generalization. Applying this theory to stereotypical typography, it can be suggested that the user or the designer was imposing a superficial interpretation of a culture to the font to exotify it, rather than attempting for authentic representation to pursue the romanticized and decorative elements that they wanted to use, that they found in a specific culture. And an ephemera that embodies this theory is souvenir photography, which is a genre of photography that was popularized in the late 19th century. They're essentially a staged photographs targeting the tourists to satisfy their curiosity for Japaneseness. And they are often very consumer driven, so it contributed to spreading the imprecise depiction of Japan. Yeah. And so essentially, Japan pre-translated its portrayal to suit the West, so then the West can eliminate and select the elements that they wanted to see and that they wanted to use. So to conclude, I do not believe everyone who uses stereotypical typography is a racist. In fact, there are Japanese fonts that mimic the characters of Thai language or the Greek. So instead, I suppose that it is our duty as designers to raise the alarm to the users and designers of stereotypical typography and to our people about the presence, because something I realize is Japanese people actually doesn't know that these Japanese styled fonts exist outside of Japan and how they are very popular. And I believe this research may not resolve the problem surrounding the stereotypical typography. However, I hope it informs and give insights to designers toward and guide them toward more culturally sensitive and thoughtful design practices. I believe this paper is only the beginning, and there are more aspects to dive into, and there are more to research. This is something extra, but I made a publication for my dissertation and I translated it in Japanese. And these works can be found on my Instagram or my website. Thank you so much for your time. Sorry, I think I spoke very fast. I'm really grateful to be here, and I'm really grateful for the DHS ambassadors and for everyone who contributed for this session to happen. Thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.
That's great, Saki. I didn't think you spoke too fast at all.
Thank you.
So I have lots of questions, but as I asked other people to do, I'll save them for when everybody has spoken, and we'll move now to Libby Brindle. So Libby Brindle is a lesbian film photography documentarian, communicator, and writer. And Libby focuses on the beauty of the unassuming in conjunction with the topics of queer identity and ephemera. And her writing and design practice is always influenced by her lived experiences and personal narratives. And Libby's going to give us a paper titled Printing for Change, the Dissemination of Queer Communication and Publications in the UK and US. So, Libby, whenever you're ready, you can get started.
Yeah, I'll just check that I'm actually sharing the right thing. Yes. Can you see that? Is it better if I go full screen?
I think full screen, yeah, if you can.
Okay, I can't see anyone, but that's fine. It's probably better for me, actually. So, the title of my paper, as Alex said, is Printing for Change. This presentation is based on the first chapter of my graduate dissertation, and I've literally just finished fashion communication and promotion at NUA, and it covered the topic of ephemera through the lens of queer culture, print publication, and political aesthetics. The ephemeral relationship between queer print dissemination and contemporary influence was important for me to understand, especially considering recent renewed discrimination towards queer people and particularly trans people. The importance of recognizable queer politics and semiotics was the key theme for this exploration, in turn forming the basis for the magnitude of understanding queer social dynamics, subcultures, political disruption, and the convergence of communication through print. So, ephemeral print follows the collection and sharing of paper-based documents that were originally made for transient, short-term use and disposal. Aside from zines, ephemera can include receipts, tickets, advertisements, and more, including everything everyone has talked about today. The aesthetics of ephemera are consistently influential to modern design, likely inspired by a call for nostalgia or a time when design was simpler amongst the contemporary postmodern culture. In recent years, there have been many archives and books covering these past forms, including Andy Altman's Tat, which covers his personal collection of ephemera. However, queer print culture was made separately from these ideals and boomed with the introduction of the xerography machine, which created the basis for the aesthetics of zines that have become synonymous with the form today. The Xerox machine was transformative to counterculture and nonconformist movements within intervals of queer print resistance. This aesthetic was central to the form with its black and white, lo-fi, photocopied appearance. Not only was the machine important for queer zinesters, but also heavily influential for punk anti-establishment communities. Archives of the production technique display a lesson on anti-art in a world of mechanical reproduction through the co-option of office materials. Ephemera and queerness have been historically intertwined. As said by Jose Esteban Munoz, queerness has instead existed as innuendo, gossip, fleeting moments, and performances that are meant to be interacted with by those within its epistemological sphere. As said by Kate Eichhorn in 2016's Adjusted Margin, on the one hand, there's nothing particularly queer about copy machines. They were hardwired for reproduction and replication, and neither are very queer traits. That said, there are things about copy machines that may have made them, by design, especially attractive machines for the queer community. In my mind, the focus on xerography and the machine's aesthetics have kind of created this political imaginary that has kind of harmed the reputation and history of a queer ephemera and its effects on language and coding. But the value in its kind of history and prominence in communication, and especially queer communication, is supported by so many pioneers and theorists. They offer a way for publishers to package themselves and their complexities and a way of communicating that frees the individual's ways of identifying. So the beauty of Xeroxing for queer people was particularly prevalent during the AIDS crisis. One of the most notable creations during this period was the artist collective Grand Fury, responsible for some of the more iconic symbolism and campaigns created through the crisis, including Silence Equals Death and AIDS 1 in 61. You can see some of their work on the left. But their controversies kind of lied in their depictions of sexuality and exploitation of imagery, as well as their direct speech to the mainstream. For example, the work Men Use Condoms or Beat It was criticized for its deliberate challenging of the dangerous myth that HIV was a gay male disease. The convenience of Xerox machines facilitated civil disobedience on a bulk scale. In an interview for the ACT UP Whole History Project, David Robertson said, "There were some people who were not comfortable speaking in front of the whole room or getting arrested or whatever, but they could stuff envelopes, they could come to a poster party and make posters, they could do guerrilla Xeroxing, and that was really valuable to make it possible for people to contribute in this variety of ways." Grand Fury had a desire to distance themselves from this kind of DIY aesthetic that most activist posters contained, but their work prevailed and continued to be disseminated through reproduced xerography. Copies defied that aversion to the Xerox aesthetic, preserving the ethos of each protest and becoming synonymous with this form of action. All of their work is also now publicly available in the public domain, so people can reproduce it legally, I suppose. So ACT UP, I'm sure most people know, but the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power was formed in response to the social neglect and government negligence towards AIDS in the 80s. Since then, the organization has worked to fight corporate greed, lack of solidarity, and various forms of discrimination at home and abroad. Grand Fury was made from members of ACT UP, so their kind of shared bond to work together really helped to facilitate their message and give them the notoriety that they have today. The participation and community of ACT UP was unprecedentedly strong and followed blueprints for the deterritorialization of scenes and subcultures, similarly to the act and circulation of punk scenes in the 70s. The capabilities of this form of dissemination through print facilitates the impact of xerography and demonstrates how queer ephemera lent itself to unionized change within the space of political disruption and repeating this process across the world. With the quote from David Robinson, I highly recommend you, if you have the time, to go and visit the ACT UP Whole History Project website. There's a library of about 187 interviews, I think it is. They are all 2 hours long, so I know no one has that time, but they all have a little extract with kind of the most important bits and quotes and everything. Over the years, the glorification of queer print culture and xerography has been a point of contention. The resolve for materials like this was to be transient. They were made out of necessity and desperation, but works are still being idolized, perhaps through the lens of nostalgia or a lack of comparable contemporary pieces. The introduction of social media has been a talk about within the culture. Zines are still made today, but they're kind of they can easily be shared online, which kind of negates that really intimate communication that was needed to collect and get these pieces of ephemera and zines and everything that was so important. But online archives are now one of the main places for historical ephemera to be seen, like the Queer Zine Archive Project or through the online database of the Bishopsgate Institute. Queer print in Europe questions this ideology. Rather than fetishize the ephemeral qualities of print or celebrate another discovery of a lost artifact of the recent queer past, how might print inform ways of thinking about queer history in the present? This line of questioning is especially prevalent in present times where Donald Trump removed nearly all LGBTQ and HIV-focused content and resources from the White House website and key federal agency web pages. When considering factors like this, alongside the changing rhetoric against trans rights in the UK, the idea of print informing ways of thinking about present queer history comes into the forefront. Increased censorship and suppression of information should culminate in the expansion and ingemination of 80s and 90s print culture, in which zines became a vital tool in sharing information, rather than us deifying the general aesthetic of the format. The recognition that this print culture has become muddied with the fetishization of zines and ephemera, and am I also not included in that by giving this presentation, is overshadowed by the sheer significance of queer evidence and accounts. A term used by Harry Hughes that stuck with me is ephemerabilia, the idea of the love for the fugitive, the fragile, and perhaps even the futile. To me, the commonality of ephemerabilia and queer archives exists as a way of preserving the lives that we as queer people have lived, and the need to make transient things matter is intimately bound with our sense of being. Much like Munoz said, our queerness has existed as innuendo in fleeting moments, so wanting to celebrate the progress that has occurred is not something that can be overlooked. In conclusion, queer print culture has been and remains an integral part of queer identity, influencing the way subcultures are formed, information is disseminated, stories are retold, and queer aesthetics began and were recognized. The significance of queer print and ephemera ranges a variety of formats, and dissecting the intricate history of the queer community's relationship with visual media and publication led to findings and arguments about how it could inform ways of thinking about queer history in the present. Documents and print are integral to the way people think, their social order and identity, and will continue to influence generations through generations to come. Political is personal, and print can broach political issues from the state to the bedroom, but they refract all these issues through the eyes and experience of the individual creating the zine. Not exclusively to queer issues and culture, anyone can use print to construct their own epistemological sphere. Theorists and authors believe that documents are influential to people, but I believe that ephemera and zines are part of us, especially to the existence of queer people. We can't be dissected and separated, for they created the world we live in today, and without the work of the visionaries of the past, life could be a lot different. So, because this covers only the first chapter of my dissertation, I have put some recommendations in. The archives, some books and zines that influenced my kind of research, and then some current exhibitions that are on if anyone is a bit closer to the centre of the UK. So the Bishopsgate Institute was really important to my research process. I unfortunately was only able to go for about an hour, but it is like 5 minutes from the Liverpool Street station in London. So if you have time and you're actually interested, please visit, because the staff are so nice and accommodating. And the researchers room, where you kind of literally can go through the archive, you get a sheet and you kind of search on the computer and then tell them what you want, they'll bring it out to you. It's like so amazing to see all that kind of history and how many people that I actually saw in there as well that wanted to be included in the same kind of research and understanding of their own culture. It's not just queer issues as well. I have a lot of stuff about London culture, protesting campaigns, that could be really good for like intersectional stuff and just general if you're looking for some inspiration. Also lots of graphic design inspiration. So a lot of the zines here I kind of from independent bookshops, and then ones like Adjusted Margin, Notes from the Underground are more journals and stuff that really influenced my research. And then there's some current exhibitions on, if anyone is interested. The Quentin Blake Centre has one on recently that is about queer comics. The Barbican has a series of queer Britain in the 60s. And there's also a new one that just opened up in Manchester that is about the 1988 march about the Section 28 proposal and everything. It's huge. It's got all of the like banners, and it's a very like heavy protest type exhibition. So thank you. I have my bibliography on here as well. If anyone has any questions, obviously ask when we get to that point. But also if you have any recommendations for me, things I should look at, I kind of have a want to do some more research after this. So anything you would think I might find interesting. If not, if you can't think of it now and you can think of it later on, my Instagram is on there as well. And happy Pride! There we go.
That's great, Livy. Thank you so much. So we're going to swiftly move on before we return to questions. So our next and final paper is going to be delivered by Maria Velasco Zambrano, and Maria is a recent graduate with an MA in History of Design from the joint programme of the RCA and the VNA in London. And her research examines everyday consumption, leisure, and material culture through a post-colonial and feminist lens. She has particular interest in how design mediates relationships between Europe and the global south, and she explores archives and ephemera as sites of alternative knowledge and cultural memory. Maria's paper is going to be called Geography of Appetite, Menus and the Visual Performance of Imperial Reach. So, Maria, whenever you're ready, please come and take the stage.
Hi, how are you? Thank you so much. I'll share my screen. Okay. Oh my God. Give me. Huh.
So, I think maybe Maria has had to leave the meeting and we'll come back and try sharing her slides again. So, we'll just give her a bit of.
All right, my apologies. I tried to
Oh,
share
there
a
you go.
screen and it told me to authorize, and then it just
Okay.
literally kicked me out and like told me to
Okay.
go in again.
Okay.
So yeah, share. And I'm hoping you can see my screen now.
We can see it. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Okay, great.
So thank you very much for having me and staying till the very end. I appreciate the space, and I want to thank the Design History Society for hosting a space such and making everyone involved, um, making it run very smoothly. My name is Maria Velasco, and my research title is The Geography of Appetite, Menus in the Visual Performance of Imperial Reach. And I want to begin briefly by situating where the interest of menus come from. Like a number of things in life, it began with a gradual disappearance of paper menus in restaurants replaced by QR codes. And physical menus became rather rare, and I found myself increasingly drawn back to historic ones, struck by how much design, time, and consideration went into the object that was ultimately intended to be discarded. In that sense, there were always ephemeral objects, a menu produced for a single dinner function almost as a single social document. Um, this interest became the subject of my undergrad dissertation, which examined menu design and the role menus play in shaping the structure and experience of an evening. For example, the picture on the right is the menu of a fan, which kind of talk about the interactive aspect of menus back in the 1950s and 30s. So the longer I spend with these objects, the more I question shift towards the other things that we can understand about the world with them. And the most closely I look, the more it became obvious that the menus were not simply design artifacts, but a distinct medium through which we can study the dynamics of politics. Because I would argue that everything is, in some sense, political, and food is not the exception. So the menu itself can be read politically, who is presented at these dinners, whose menus survive in an institution archive, and within the dinner itself, who was considered even worthy of receiving a menu. So dining spaces then become, for me, an unexpected entry to point into political history. Because of it, I am very conscious to tell the stories that are unrepresented in these archives. And menus might not be the best tool in order to do that, but they are very well particularly suited to is to understand the empire and the British Empire in its own terms through the way it chose to represent itself. And that's what my talk today is going to be about. And this research began because I encountered a menu in the National Archives during a visit that was not originally intended as a research. I went because they were doing a talk of exploration of the collection, and they brought a random box, literally, but had a menu that mentioned Palestine. And this struck me at a moment when existence of Palestine has become online a subject of debate, with some arguing it appeared only on maps and little less. But there was something very striking in finding this acknowledgement within an object that was never intended to last, something generally ephemeral. And this was the point in which I began to recognize this particular kind of evidentiary power in the ephemeral materials. By their nature, they carry a certain honesty. They were produced to be used and discarded, and yet occasionally they really signify kept as souvenirs, signed, annotated, and that allow us as historians to look at other things. And this became the starting point of my argument, is that menus allow us to access internal, largely unspoken discourses through which British Empire negotiated its own identity. In the interwar period, the empire continued by most measures to expand economically, yet this was also a period marked by competing and often contradictory identities. Early historiography tended to characterize the British Empire as possessing a single coherent identity. More recent scholarship, however, has emphasized that the extent to which identity was internally fractured and contested. Menus, I would suggest, offer a way to these discourses. Material and visual culture allow us to observe an empire experiencing what might have been described as a dual crisis, one in which, in practice, is approaching its end while continuing visually and rhetorically to assert an image of permanence and greatness. So for this specific project, I focus on the Colonial Office archive in the National Archive, specifically files cataloged as simply miscellaneous in relationship to the colonies. John Mackenzie, in his work Propaganda for the British Empire, defines propaganda as a transmission of ideas and values from one person or group of person to another, with the specific intention of influencing the recipient's attitudes in ways that interests of authors will be enhanced. Imperial design in this framing is not something simply decoded from the everyday objects after the fact. Rather, such objects play a continued role in the lived everyday empire practice. So I want to turn to a pivotal moment, the British Empire exhibition held at Wembley in 1924-1925. At the time, this was largely regarded as a success, and the press framed it as an exercise in educated British public about the empire, demonstrating its scale and its continually economic viability. And this was, of course, Britain still recovering for the First World War, and it had very limited economic capacity. However, greatly it had such like tensions, particularly around the questions with identity, especially the African pavilions provoked considerably discomfort the same way that India, following the Government India Act, occupied increasingly fractured position within the imperial structure. And although these strengths and these bonds became Britain's and its colony, and the exhibition became like a flashpoint, and it prompted, for example, African students to create the Pan-African resistance. And it's within this exhibition that, while, for example, you have the West African Pavilion, where you have what you will call today a human zoo happening, you also have these very fancy dinners for the commissioners of the empire, which is a very contrasting image in regarding who is attending these dinners and who is actually like in the exhibition themselves. These dinners became to expose the disjunction between the empire vision of itself and its reality, and how the guests of the tables are completely white, while the exhibition itself is trying to promote a vision of plurality in the imperial world. So going to the menus then allow us to start looking at what the kind of message the high upper classes that were invited to these dinners were trying to convey themselves of like what the British Empire was trying to be. And I would like to start with this menu of the African World dinner in the Savoy Hotel. The first aspect that is very important to call is that it's called the Cape to Cairo dinner. And this refers to the proposal railway intended to connect Cape Town to Cairo, and was a project that was never realized, not for lack of ambition, but of sheets of scale and territorial claim. as it represented an assertion of ownership of the territory, of the African territory by the British colonies. And there's two features that I would really like to stand out in this menu, and is that first, the menu is written in French and is keeping with the convention of what fashionable dining is for the time. The legacy of popularization of the French cuisine as like the international cuisine comes all the way back from the 19th century. But it's very clear that it's a choice, and I will show in other menus why this is a particular choice. But most significant, I really like the idea of how through the course you're also going through the African territory. The courses themselves enact the Cape to Cairo project. The menu takes a dinner journey, for example, through oysters from the Atlantic, and then you finish with the, of course, coffee of Cairo. But it's a call of the places where the vision of the British Empire was expanding themselves. So we can say that the dinner itself become a performance of empire and a vision of expansion of the British wish project. And then we can compare this to another dinner, the dinner at Hotel Cecil of that same year. Is in the same like margins of the British exhibition. But this one was hosted by the exhibition commissioners. And as I was telling you in the first menu, the language is French. And here we are doing English, which is not very fashionable at the time at all. And in this menu, we see like a more dialogue in between putting England in the center of the world and the other colonies. So in here, again, it opens with oyster, but draws the empire rather as a whole and not just Africa specifically. British cocktails appear, wines from Australia appears, and cigar from Jamaica. So he's really thinking, where are all this food coming from, and how we have the capacity to bring all these to the center of the empire. And this menu, I think, presents the empire as a vast and diverse space of abundant resources, and fundamentally a very mercantilist vision of what the British thought the world was, in which these territories matter primarily for what they were going to produce. Again, this is another menu from the Kingston upon Hull dinner. And in this one, again, it's in English, but I'm more curious about the use of style rather than just mentioning where the food is coming from. So in the previous menu, when it's saying from, like we understand that we are extracting, here is more an adaptation where we can recognize that other places do have style. So we have lobsters Canadian way, rice Indian style, but also goes into how do we bring again the Britishness with English fashion Surrey chicken. And I think this all connects directly to the development years later. The Marketing Empire Board commissioned an artist, MacDonald Gill, to produce a poster titled Highways of Empire. And maps were kind of used to legitimize this reality of conquest and empire. But in a way, it puts Britain in the center, and this map kind of allows us to see how these trades were thought in how we extract the resources of these spaces. And jumping now from the British Empire exhibition, then there's also this like idea of how the British Empire was also navigating and negotiating with itself and its identity. So we previously see with these three dinners in the British Empire exhibition, like this idea of greatness and extraction. But in these menus that I think they're really funny in the way they're saving the archive, because pretty much if somebody complained that there's curry on the menu, and pretty much the board of the Indian office price ship and the Colonial Commission are very offended because the vessel is used for transport of soldiers, and in this case, it holds lots of Indian soldiers. So we have this relationship of we are using India as a territory, we're using its people, and but we're not going to make them eat the British food. We're also going to offer them the traditional curry. But that was unthinkable of these white men that had to use the vessel and then was very offended by it. So I think it's very interesting in how like it Britain itself does negotiate and understand that these entities and like these colonies are like have identities themselves and like negotiate with the British identity. And I guess then when regarding of what the British identity is, we can think of menus as another part of how do we extend this idea of the British Empire. And in here, the menus, while the food is still very British, the other way the menus can allow us to think of the British Empire and like the reflections in it are in a more graphic design aspect. And this idea comes from like the traveling of the empire and the consumable landscapes. And this brings me to a further dimension of the design as a form of ideological navigation and how the empire represented itself to traveling. So these two menus are found in journals of delegates of the Empire Commission. Very famously, the guy in the picture with his dog is C.T. Lawrence, and he's the one that actually organized the whole pavilion in the British Empire exhibition of West Africa. But this is the consumption of this landscape through like the ocean liners and the cruise ships of like the ocean liner companies that allow us to understand how they kind of operate within each other. So on the menu on the left, we have like this cape, very landscape, but it become kind of like it could be anywhere. Is the landscape of is something very specific, but it could also be anywhere. And how do they start consuming this? So the vessels employ this visual language of an idyllic consumable landscape while continuing to hold these very international cuisines, because at the end of the day, these vessels did want to make people feel very at home. And that also include the food that they offered and the visual design of the menus continue this project of imperial fantasy. And as William Miller has observed, the decorative scheme of the first class in colonial liners, such as the Viceroy of India, was conceived so that passengers would really feel like they never left a London club or the English country home. So they even carry advertisement, and there's lots of studies in regarding the visual advertisement of the cruise ship lines that really describe the voyage as the way of exploring, but also the way home. Travel always British. And this is very shown in, for example, these menus of the Orient Line that are heading to Australia, and they're trying to kind of showcase through this whole landscape, oh, this is what's waiting for you, this idyllic image of Australia through the parrotfish and through their cockatoos and little birds. This also talks about like how much effort they were putting in these menus. Like they commission an artist. Usually they would be print it back in land, and then they would have a print in the boat. So then everybody like once the chef had decided what meal was going to be, they would print it inside. So there was a lot of logistics, but this illustration in many ways represent a picturesque, even beautiful, yet presented an idealized version of these places. Like I'm pretty sure like these birds are gorgeous, but that's not what you would have encounter once you land in Australia. It's a very idyllic image. And I guess I want to finish with this one because to me is almost at the end of the empire, but it's still this holding of the idea of what the empire is. To me, this image is very capturing in regarding of how the British Empire was really holding the last bits of what they thought of greatness. It captures exactly how the British Empire came to understand itself and position itself in the center of the world. The illustration depicts, of course, a king holding a globe, with Britain naturally kind of not shown, but it's shown everything like the other parts of the world that is shown is the places Britain usually tend to consume in terms of materialistic and tend to extract. So it's fundamentally an image of consumption, the king that holds the entire world in his hands and who might quite literally consume it. It is in the subject such as this, designed to be disregarded and lost, that we might have evidence of something much larger and in a historical record that can offer. And to me, these menus and many others in the in the archives hold a vision of how the British Empire wished to see itself, right at the point where that vision began to unravel. Thank you.
That's excellent. Thank you, Maria. I love in that last image, the king also looks like he's holding the globe as if it's like a full belly, right?
Yeah,
Looks as if they've
100%. Like
just
he already
finished a
ate it.
meal. Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely excellent. Great. So three brilliant talks. I have a couple of questions, but